Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to hook you up with great theories of everything from probably sources that you haven't heard of before or you don't know too much about. Grand unified theories, theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses and tour de forces, cosmologies and cosmogonies, and things that one individual spent their whole life working on, and nobody was there to read it at the end, even though they hit a home run and put together a great effort, but now their work is in jeopardy of falling onto the scrap heap of history. And so we're trying to take these things off the scrap heap of history so that we can dig into them a little bit more for our own edification, our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our formation of a holistic worldview, our quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health upon applying the lessons we learn from these cosmologies. Today is our 31st day, and probably our last day, going over the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Michael Bagent and Richard Lee from 1991. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, and there were many more findings in jars, mostly in caves outside of Qumran, about 20 miles from Jerusalem, in the middle of the desert, right by the Dead Sea, at the lowest elevation on the planet. And the deception part of the Dead Sea Scrolls deception, according to the authors, is the behavior of the international team of scholars who were appointed to take custody of these texts and to sort them out, to translate them, and to put them back into circulation with the general public, especially scholars out there. And they didn't keep up their end of the bargain. I believe most of these people on the international team were Catholic priests, and I believe in their work of translating these documents, they came upon more than they bargained for. They were basically assuming that these Dead Sea Scrolls were going to uphold their belief systems. But instead, they tore their belief systems to shreds. And as a result, the international team, rather than putting egg on their face, they just decided to suppress the documents entirely and to divert by publishing irrelevant parts of the documents, and to kick the can down the road and stall for time so as not to end up publishing anything. And 35 years later, most of the explosive material from the Dead Sea Scrolls had not been published by 1990. And some people were starting to get mad about it, especially Robert Eisenman. And, the Dead Sea Scrolls was a huge find. There were several hundred volumes of stuff, including all of the Old Testament books. The dating of the scrolls is anywhere from 200 BC up until even 132 AD. And so through the first century AD, the Christian era beginning, and that was kind of the most explosive part of the findings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not so much all of the Old Testament texts, but the new material that was called sectarian, that was related to the sect of zealous Jews who put together these scrolls in the first place, who lived in and around Qumran in a monastery type situation. Not exactly, because there were monastery and nunnery kind of type situation, I guess. And yeah, so they never published any of that stuff. And eventually, Robert Eisenman started threatening them with legal action and so on. And a lot of the people had died by that time. And so the stuff eventually, people took photographs and it came out there. But, it's kind of was lost to history to a great extent, because the people who were all enthusiastic about the findings in the original in the 40s and 50s never really got to see these things come out. And by the time they did come out, the people who were around at that time didn't really even know what they were. And so there was a disconnect, and I don't think that the world has really learned what it needs to learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls, including me. And so we probably are going to be going over some of the Dead Sea Scrolls as we move along through this Reciprocal Church unit, one over church. And we are in the postscript of this book. And so he's talking about, the authors are talking about other possible finds in addition to the Dead Sea Scrolls. What other instances of people finding lost ancient documents in jars or caves or all of the above. And so he just talked about how Origen had, who was a 3rd century Christian writer at least, and he had found some texts which had been lost. And he says one version of the Psalms, we are told, was found at Jericho in a jar during the reign of Antoninus, son of Severus. And this reference allows us to date the discovery somewhere between 211 and 217 AD. More intriguing still is a letter dating from sometime shortly before 805 AD, written by Timotheus, patriarch of Seleucia, to another ecclesiastic. Quote, "We learned from trustworthy Jews who were being instructed in the Christian faith that 10 years ago near Jericho, some books were found in a cave. The dog of an Arab hunter followed an animal into a cave and didn't return. The Arab went in after it and found a small cave in which there were many books. The Arab went to Jerusalem and told the Jews there, who then came out in large numbers and found books of the Old Testament and other books in Hebrew characters. As the person who told this story to me was a learned man, I asked him about the many references in the New Testament which are referred to as originating in the Old Testament, which cannot be found there. He said they exist and can be found in the books from the cave." End quote. Similar discoveries have continued to occur through the centuries up until modern times. One of the most famous is that of Moses William Shapira, an antique dealer with a shop in Jerusalem in the late 19th century. In 1878, Shapira was told of some Arabs who, on the run from the authorities, had sought refuge in what is now Jordanian territory on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. Here in a cave at Wadi Mujib, directly across the Dead Sea from En Gedi, they were reported to have found a number of old bundles of rags, which they tore open, hoping to find valuables of some kind. They found only a number of dark leather scrolls. One of the Arabs took these away with him and later claimed that possession of them had brought him luck. This was said to be his reason for not wanting to sell them or for raising the price. Shapira, who sold antiquities to European collectors and museums, was intrigued. Through a sheikh with whom he was friendly, he managed to purchase what purported to be the entire corpus of material. This comprised 15 strips of parchment, each about 3.5 by 7 inches in size. After studying his acquisition for some weeks, Shapiro realized that what he had was an ancient version of the Book of Deuteronomy, one which differed markedly from the established biblical texts. In 1883, after a number of vicissitudes and consultations with experts, Shapiro brought his scroll fragments to London. He was preceded by great excitement and extensive coverage in the press. British experts pronounced the fragments genuine, and translations of them were published in the Times. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, came to see them and discussed their possible purchase with Shapira. A sum of £1 million was apparently mentioned, a staggering figure for the time. The French government sent a prominent scholar, one of Shapira's old enemies, across the channel to examine the fragments and compile a report. Shapira refused to let the Frenchman inspect the fragments closely or to handle them. The Frenchman was allowed only a cursory look at 2 or 3 fragments. He was then reduced by Shapira's intransigence to spending 2 days looking at 2 additional fragments on display in a glass case, jostled by other visitors to the museum. Out of spite and a probably justified exasperation, the Frenchman at last pronounced the fragments to be forgeries. Other scholars, without even bothering to look at the fragments, echoed this conclusion, and the affair quickly degenerated into farce. Shapira had effectively ruined himself. Repudiated and discredited, he shot himself in a Rotterdam hotel on March 9, 1884. His scroll fragments were purchased by a London antiquarian book dealer for £10, 5 shillings. Since then, they have disappeared, though they might conceivably still turn up in someone's attic or among the belongings of some private collector. According to the last attempt to trace them, they may have been taken to Australia with the effects of a dealer in antiquities. A number of modern authorities, including John Allegro, who made a special study of Shapira, have become convinced that Shapira's fragments were probably genuine. Had they been discovered this century rather than last, Allegro maintained they would in all likelihood have proved to be as valid as the material found at Qumran. But in the late 19th century, egos, scholarly reputations, and vested interests were as much on the line as they are today. As a result, something of potentially priceless value has almost certainly been irretrievably lost. At the same time, discoveries such as Shapira's continue to be made. Thus, for example, in the late 1970s, when we ourselves had little more than a cursory knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other such documents, we were telephoned by a friend from Paris, a collector of antiques. He asked if, on virtually no notice, we could meet him at a restaurant in London, not far from Charing Cross. Michael Bagent, who'd done much professional photography, was particularly requested. He was asked to bring a camera along and keep it hidden. Bagent found our associate in the company of 3 other men, an American collector, a Palestinian dealer, and a Jordanian engineer. He accompanied them to a nearby bank, where they were ushered into a small private room and 2 wooden chests were produced, each locked with 3 padlocks. "We don't know what's in these chests," one of the bank officials said pointedly. "We don't want to know what's in them." The officials then left, locking Bagent and his 4 companions in the room. A telephone call was made to Jerusalem, and some sort of permission was obtained. The Jordanian engineer then produced a bunch of keys and proceeded to open the 2 chests. Inside, there were literally hundreds of thin cardboard sheets, each holding, attached by adhesive tape, a dozen or so fragments of ancient parchment and or papyrus. The fragments obviously spanned a considerable period of time, derived from a number of diverse sources, and had been inscribed in several different languages, Aramaic, for example, Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic. As might be expected of so eclectic and haphazard an assemblage, not everything was of value. Many of the fragments proved subsequently to be worthless. Receipts and documents pertaining to ancient commercial transactions that might have been ferreted out of some archaic rubbish tip. But there were others as well. The collection had come to London through the clandestine scroll market active in Jerusalem and Bethlehem during the 1950s and 60s, and had been brought out of Israel during or shortly after the 1967 war. It was now supposedly being offered for sale to a certain unnamed European government for an alleged price of £3 million. Bagent was asked to make a selection of photographs to be displayed as samples of what was available. He took approximately 100 photographs, but there were hundreds of sheets and altogether upwards of 2,000 fragments, most of them relatively large. In the dozen or so years since this incident, we have heard nothing further about the collection. If a sale was indeed negotiated, it was done so quietly, with no public announcement of any kind. Alternatively, the entire collection may still be sequestered in its London bank, or in some other similar depository elsewhere, or amongst the treasures of some private dealer. Transactions such as the one we'd been peripherally privy were not, we subsequently learned, at all uncommon. During the course of the next decade, our research was to bring us into contact with an intricate network of antique dealers and collectors engaged in subterranean scroll traffic. This network is international. This network is international and deals on a scale comparable to that of networks trafficking in paintings or gems. Hundreds of thousands of pounds can be purchased on virtually immediate notice and be transferred on the basis of a handshake. 2 factors have conducted to the dissemination of the underground scroll market. One was the action of Yadin and the Israeli military in the immediate aftermath of the 1967 war, when the dealer known as Kondo was held for interrogation and forced to divulge the existence of the temple scroll. Not surprisingly, this action upset the existing truce and fostered a profound mistrust between Israeli and Arab dealers. As a result, much material found by the Bedouin, which would ordinarily have passed into Israeli hands, now finds its way illegally to Amman or Damascus or even further afield. From there, it passes to the west via such routes as Turkey or Lebanon. Second spur to the subterranean scroll market was a law instituted under the auspices of UNESCO, according to which any antiquities smuggled out of a country must be returned to their point of origin. This law was made retroactive. In consequence, individuals who had invested large sums in scroll material or hoped to obtain large sums for scroll material could not afford to make their holdings public. In effect, the law drove the clandestine traffic in scrolls even further underground and, of course, caused a dramatic increase in prices. How does the underground scroll trade operate? Much of it is controlled by certain families well known in the antique trade, who supply many of the legal antiquities on sale in Israel and abroad. During the course of the last half-century, these families have established their own intelligence networks, which maintain close contacts with the Bedouin and keep abreast of all rumors, whispers, legends, and reported discoveries of antiquarian interest. When a potentially fruitful site is located, the land will be rented for a year and a large black Bedouin tent, ostensibly a domicile, will be erected. At night, excavations will be conducted under the tent. When all antiquities of value have been removed, the tent will be dismantled and its occupants will move on. A similar process occurs in towns, and particularly in Jerusalem, which has proved especially fertile territory. Sites will be rented for short periods or, if necessary, purchased. If a house does not already exist, one will be constructed. The occupants will then excavate downwards from the cellar to bedrock. Through such procedures as these, much scroll material has found its way into the hands of private collectors and investors. This material entirely circumvents the world of official archaeology and biblical scholarship. Indeed, the world of official archaeology and biblical scholarship often does not even realize it exists. Unknown to the academics, there is at present a substantial quantity of Qumran and related material in the hands of collectors or for sale. We ourselves know of numerous fragments. We know of a well-preserved copy of one Qumran text called the Book of Jubilees. We know of a handful of letters by Simeon Bar Kokhba, and there are substantial grounds for believing that other documents of a much more explosive nature, utterly unique and undreamed of by the world of scholarship, also exist. In the course of the next few years, major developments can be expected from any or all of these distinct quarters. The most obvious of these, needless to say, is the Qumran material itself. Now that the entire corpus of this material is readily accessible, independent scholars, without preconceptions, without axes to grind and vested interests to protect, can get to work. The international team's orthodoxy of interpretation has already begun to come under attack. And as this book has demonstrated, the supposed archaeological and paleographical evidence with which they support their position will not withstand close scrutiny. In consequence, we can expect a radical revision of the process whereby dates have been assigned to a number of particularly important texts. As a result, new contexts and interpretations will emerge for already familiar material, and new material will emerge in perspectives that would have been cursorily and high-handedly dismissed a few years ago. Yeah, well, I'm definitely interested in kind of following up on this story because this book was written so long ago. We don't really know what happened with these Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, have they all been translated, and what was the upshot? What have scholars learned over the last 35 years about what's in these texts and what ramifications they have. If anybody knows of a recent text that kind of goes over some of that stuff, I'd love to hear about that. In the meantime, I will look for something like that to present here on this channel. At the same time, there is also the possibility enhanced by each new archaeological expedition Eisenman and his colleagues undertake to Qumran and the shores of the Dead Sea, that wholly new material may come to light. This possibility will be further enhanced now that the Israeli government has granted permission for its use by deployment of the subsurface interface radar system. Finally, there is the clandestine scroll market, which may at any moment cough up something of unprecedented consequence, something hitherto kept secret, at last released into public domain. As we have said, such material exists. The question is simply if and when those who hold it decide it can be divulged. Whatever the quarter or quarters from which new material might issue, fresh and in some cases very major revelations are bound to be forthcoming. As this occurs, we can expect ever more light to be shed on biblical history, on the character of ancient Judaism, on the origins of both Christianity and Islam. One should not, of course, expect a disclosure of such magnitude to topple the church, or anything as apocalyptic as that. The church today, after all, is less a religious than a social, cultural, political, and economic institution. Its stability and security rest on factors quite remote from the creed, the doctrine, and the dogma it promulgates. But some people, at any rate, may be prompted to wonder whether the church, an institution so demonstrably lax, biased, and unreliable in its own scholarship, its own version of its history and origins, should necessarily be deemed reliable and authoritative in its approach to such urgent contemporary matters as overpopulation, birth control, the status of women, and the celibacy of the clergy. Ultimately, however, the import of the Qumran text resides in something more than their potential to embarrass the church. The real import of the Qumran text resides in what they have to reveal of the Holy Land, that soil which, for so many centuries, has voraciously soaked up so much human blood. Blood shed in the name of conflicting gods, or to be more accurate, not very dissimilar versions of the same God. Perhaps the documents yet to be divulged may confront us a little more inescapably with the scale and pointlessness of our own madness, and shame us thereby, at least by a degree or so, in the general direction of sanity. The Dead Sea Scrolls offer a new perspective on the three great religions born in the Middle East. The more one examines those religions, the more one will discern not how much they differ, but how much they overlap and have in common, how much they derive from essentially the same source, and the extent to which most of the quarrels between them, when not precipitated by a simple misunderstanding, have stemmed less from spiritual values than from politics, from greed, from selfishness, and the presumptuous arrogance of interpretation. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all, at present, beset by a resurgent fundamentalism. One would like to believe, though this may be too much to hope for, that greater understanding of their common roots might help curb the prejudice, the bigotry, the intolerance, and fanaticism to which fundamentalism is chronically prone. All right, that's the end of the book. So yeah, I mean, I think they get a little bit too alarmed about all the fundamentalism, and probably not alarmed enough about the obfuscation and so on. But thought it was a good exposition of what the Dead Sea Scrolls have to offer, and gives us a little bit of context to get into some of those Dead Sea Scrolls over the time. Definitely some of the sectarian material, the Temple Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, and maybe some other things. Now, where we're headed from here, I believe tomorrow I'm going to begin to talk about our upcoming New Testament decode. So I believe we're going to start with the book of Luke. We're going to try to decode that whole book. And I'm going to be introducing that topic then tomorrow, I believe, unless I find something else that that needs to go in there before that. But I'm going to kind of be introducing the different ciphers that we will be using for decoding the New Testament. Now, obviously, the first cipher is just the surface interpretation. And then there are many other layers of meaning that are embedded within the text, depending on which cipher you use. There's a mythological, astrological, a physiological, one related to several conspiratorial ones, one based on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the language introduced in the Dead Sea Scrolls that is repeated in the Gospels, and then a couple that are based on the Caesars, Julius Caesar, and the much later Flavian dynasty Caesars. And so we're going to just give an overview of that, and then get into the text of Luke and kind of read through it and stop whenever there is a kind of an interpretation moment, and see if we can make anything of that text other than the surface. We will also, we'll mention the surface as well. But, I think that in many cases our interpretations of the Bible texts are